The truth is simple, and it still hurts to say it out loud. My parents did not come to my wedding. They were not sick. They were not stranded. They did not miss a flight or lose an invitation. They chose not to be there. This story is an original creation by the writing team of the Revenge Sins channel, inspired by the hidden corners of family life and told with the purpose of fostering emotional connection and spreading understanding. I stood at the front of the ceremony, hands shaking slightly as I held Ethan's, and I kept my eyes forward because I already knew what I would see if I looked to my left. 2 empty chairs, no last-minute excuses, no whispered apologies, just absence, clean and deliberate. Someone behind me murmured, "They'll be here any second," and I said nothing. Ethan leaned closer and whispered, "We're ready whenever you are. Not we'll wait. Not it's okay if you need time. Just ready." That word mattered more than he knew. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, the silence felt heavier than it should have. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, calm and careful. This wasn't what we expected. My father would have nodded beside her, saying nothing. As always, at the reception, my aunt hugged me too tightly and said, "You look beautiful, Claire," then added, too quickly, "They must be so proud." I smiled because that was easier than explaining the truth. Later, while guests clinked glasses, Ethan's sister leaned over and asked, "Do you want us to move the seating chart?" I shook my head. "No," I said. "Leave it. I needed those empty seats to stay visible. Pretending they were not there would have been another lie layered on top of all the others." Ethan asked quietly, "Do you want me to say something?" "No," I told him. "Not today. If you are listening to this and you have ever learned to make yourself smaller to keep the peace, you already know why I said that, and if this story feels familiar, stay with me. What happened next mattered far more than the wedding itself, because to understand why my parents did not come, you have to understand my family and the role I was never allowed to stop playing. In my family, there was always a script, and everyone knew their lines. My sister Maddie learned hers early. At school events, teachers would smile and say, "You must be so proud of her." And my mother, Elaine, would straighten her posture and reply, "She's always been exceptional." Maddie stood beside her, chin lifted, already comfortable being admired. When it was my turn, the words changed. "This is Claire," my mother would say. "She's doing well. Doing well. Not exceptional. Not impressive. Just acceptable." At home, the difference was even clearer. When Maddie brought home awards, my parents cleared space on the mantle. When she landed her first internship, my father, Richard, opened a bottle of wine and said, "This is only the beginning." When I graduated with my degree in computer science, my mother nodded and said, "That's practical. You'll always have work." I waited for more. It never came. Elaine watched my body the way she watched Maddie's resume. "You'd feel better if you tried harder," she said once, sliding a brochure for a fitness program across the kitchen counter. Another time she added, "Your sister never struggles with this. She's disciplined." I learned to hear discipline as worth. Richard rarely intervened. If I pushed back, he would sigh and say, "Your mother just wants what's best." His silence made her words feel official. By the time Maddie moved to Chicago for her corporate role, my parents spoke about her life as if it were a shared project. "Her network is incredible," Elaine said during one holiday dinner. "The people she's meeting are important." Maddie smiled and corrected her gently. "Strategic, not important." Elaine laughed, proud of the distinction. When I mentioned my own job in Austin, my mother asked, "Is that still remote work?" "It's a senior role," I said. "That's nice," she replied, already turning back to Maddie. "Now, tell us about the gala." I tried for years to earn a different response. I joined clubs they suggested. I changed how I dressed. For a brief, humiliating stretch. I even attempted modeling because Maddie once said, "You'd have to lose weight first." Obviously. When I failed, she reminded me of it with a smile that never reached her eyes. Eventually, something in me went quiet. I stopped offering updates. I stopped bringing achievements to the table like proof. At family gatherings, I listened while my parents discussed Maddie's promotions, her travel, her future. I smiled when expected. I left early when I could. No one noticed the shift. As long as Maddie was shining, the script was intact, and I was still playing my part, whether I spoke or not. I stopped competing in my late 20s, though no one in my family realized it. At first, it looked the same from the outside. I still showed up for holidays. I still brought a dish. I still asked my parents how they were doing. The difference was in what I no longer offered. At one Thanksgiving dinner, my mother said, "Maddie just finished another quarter ahead of projections." "That's impressive," I replied, because that was my line. She turned to me. "And you, I'm good." I said, "Nothing more." Elaine frowned slightly, as if waiting for the rest of the sentence. When it didn't come, she filled the silence herself. "Well, stability is important too." Richard nodded. "As long as you're comfortable." Comfortable. It sounded like a ceiling. After that, I learned how to make myself invisible without leaving the room. I asked neutral questions. I laughed at the right moments. When Maddie talked about her life in Chicago, I listened without flinching. When she said, "You wouldn't understand how competitive it is," I said, "You're probably right." She blinked, surprised, then smiled. Winning by default had always been easier for her. Phone calls with my parents grew shorter. My mother would say, "We're busy this week," and I would answer, "That's fine." When I stopped chasing their attention, they assumed I no longer needed it. Once, my father asked, "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" "Yes," I said, and meant it in a way that didn't include him. I built a life that did not revolve around their approval. I focused on my work. I made friends who didn't ask me to justify my existence. I learned how to enjoy evenings without replaying conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said differently. At a family gathering near Christmas, my mother pulled me aside and said, "You seem distant. I'm just tired," I replied. She accepted that answer easily. Distance never bothered her as long as it didn't disrupt the image of closeness she presented to others. By the time I met Ethan, I had already stepped out of the competition. I just didn't know yet that leaving the game would be treated as a betrayal. I met Ethan at a technology conference, the kind where people talked more about themselves than their work. We were introduced by a mutual colleague who said, "You two should meet. You think the same way." That turned out not to be true at all, but it was close enough. During a break between sessions, Ethan asked, "What do you actually enjoy building?" Not what I did for a living, not where I saw myself in 5 years. Enjoy was new. When I told him, he listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "That makes sense. No critique, no improvement suggestions, just acceptance." On our third date, I apologized for canceling the week before. My family needed me, I said automatically. He looked at me and replied, "Did they?" I laughed it off, but the question stayed with me. Ethan never competed with the people in my life. He never asked where he ranked. When I mentioned my sister's career, he said, "That sounds impressive," and then added, "How do you feel about it?" No one had ever asked me that. When he met my parents, my mother smiled politely and said, "Claire has always been independent." It was not meant as praise. Ethan didn't flinch. On the drive home, he said, "They seem very invested in your sister." "That's normal," I replied. He nodded, but he didn't agree. After 4 years together, the proposal happened quietly. We were at home, eating takeout and watching something neither of us was fully paying attention to. Ethan turned to me and said, "I don't want to be impressive. I want to be steady." Then he asked if I would marry him. There was no audience to perform for, no one to outshine, just a choice. When I told my mother, she paused for a moment too long. "Are you sure you're ready?" she asked. "Marriage changes things. I know," I said. She smiled thinly. "Well, just make sure you're taking care of yourself." Ethan noticed the tension I pretended not to feel. Later that night, he said, "You don't have to convince me." I wasn't, I replied, and realized how often I had been convincing everyone else. With him, I did not need to audition. I only needed to show up. The first sign came the night we told my parents we were engaged. My mother held the phone away from her ear for a moment, as if checking the connection. "You're sure?" she asked. Not congratulations. Not "I'm happy for you." Just certainty. "Yes," I said. "We're sure." There was a pause. "Well," Elaine continued carefully, "marriage is a big step. You might want to slow down. Focus on your health first." She said health the way she used to say discipline. My father was quiet. I could hear him breathing, waiting for the call to end. At the engagement dinner a few weeks later, my parents arrived late and sat near the edge of the table. My mother smiled at Ethan and said, "So, tell us about yourself." When he answered, she nodded politely, then glanced at her phone. She checked it again, and again. Halfway through the meal, she stood up and walked toward the hallway, phone pressed to her ear. My father followed a moment later. When they returned, my mother's eyes were red. "Everything okay?" I asked. She waved a hand. "Just family things." Ethan leaned toward me and whispered, "I heard your sister crying." I stiffened. "What did they say?" He hesitated. "Your mother said this wasn't how they imagined things would happen. I told myself it meant nothing. I needed it to mean nothing. Wedding planning made the divide harder to ignore. My mother had ideas for Maddie's future wedding, ideas she shared freely. "She'll need something elegant," Elaine said once, "a venue that reflects her status." When I asked about my own plans, she said, "Do whatever feels manageable." When I showed her the dress I chose, she looked me up and down. "It's practical," she said. "It works for your body." That was all. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages were met with, "We're busy right now." When I asked if they had received the invitations, my mother replied, "We'll check." She never did. Ethan noticed everything I pretended not to see. One night he said, "They're creating distance. They just need time." I replied. He didn't argue. He just said, "I don't want you blaming yourself for this." I nodded, even though I already was. By the time the wedding date approached, silence had replaced tension. It felt intentional, like something being decided without me in the room. I kept moving forward anyway, because stopping would have meant admitting what was already forming beneath the surface. The cracks were there. I just wasn't ready to name them. The morning of the wedding moved faster than I expected. There was no time to overthink, no space to linger on what might go wrong. People kept asking questions. Someone needed a decision. Someone else needed a signature. I focused on what was in front of me because it was easier than thinking about who was not. An hour before the ceremony, Ethan asked, "Have you heard from them?" "No," I said. He nodded once. "Okay. Not they'll come. Not maybe they're late. Just okay." When I walked to the front, I felt steady. That surprised me. I had imagined my legs shaking, my chest tightening. Instead, there was a calm I did not trust. I looked out at the guests and saw familiar faces, warm smiles, people who had made the effort to be there, and then I saw the empty chairs. My aunt leaned toward my mother-in-law and whispered something. Margaret Brooks shook her head gently and said, "We're here." I did not hear the words, but I saw her hand tighten around the program. The officiant began. His voice carried, clear and patient. When he reached the part about family and support, I felt something shift inside me. Not a break, a settling. At the reception, people tried to protect me from the truth by pretending it did not exist. Everything looks beautiful. Someone said, "You must be so happy." I smiled and said, "I am, because both things could be true at once." When the music changed and couples moved toward the dance floor, the space beside me stayed empty. The band leader glanced over and asked quietly, "Are we doing the father-daughter dance?" "No," I said. "We're not." He nodded, no questions asked, and moved on. Later, my cousin approached with a glass of wine and said, "They'll regret this." "I know," I replied. I was not angry when I said it. I was certain. Ethan found me near the edge of the room. "Do you need air?" he asked. "I need you," I said. He took my hand. That was enough. When the night ended, people hugged me and told me how much the day had meant to them. My mother-in-law kissed my cheek and said, "You did this with grace." My father-in-law added, "We're proud of you." Those words landed harder than I expected. On the drive home, Ethan said, "They made a choice today." "Yes," I replied, "and so did you." He continued, "You didn't let it define the day." I looked out the window and said, "I didn't let it define me." By the time we arrived home, the quiet felt earned. The wedding was over. The absence remained. And for the first time, I understood that their silence was not confusion or delay. It was a decision they had been preparing to make long before that day ever arrived. We came back from the honeymoon to a message from my mother asking when I could talk. No mention of the wedding, no acknowledgement of absence, just logistics. When we finally spoke, she began calmly. "We were surprised you were upset," Elaine said. "We assumed you understood." "Understood what I replied," she exhaled, as if choosing her words carefully. "We didn't think it was a formal wedding. We thought it was something small, casual. It was a ceremony," I said, "with invitations." "Well," she continued, "you never really involved us. We didn't feel needed," my father added. "Your mother was hurt." I waited for an apology. It did not come. "You could have asked," Elaine said. "We would have helped if we'd known you wanted us there. I sent the invitations," I said. My voice stayed even. I followed up. She ignored that. "You've always been independent. We assumed you preferred it that way." There it was. Independence as accusation. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from anger, but from recognition. This was not confusion. This was reframing. They were rewriting the event so they could remain blameless. Ethan sat beside me and said, "They didn't say they missed you." "No," I replied. "They said they misunderstood the importance." "Yes." He nodded. "That's different." Later that week, my aunt called and said, "Your mother told everyone she thought it was a low-key thing. It wasn't." I said, "I know," she replied quietly. The explanation spread faster than the truth, but it did not settle the way my parents expected. People began asking careful questions. They compared notes. The story shifted in ways Elaine could not control. When my mother called again, she said, "Your silence is making things awkward." "I'm not silent," I said. "I'm just not correcting your version." "That's unfair," she replied. "It's accurate," I said. She ended the call abruptly. That was when I understood the real boundary I had crossed. It was not getting married first. It was refusing to help them manage how it looked. They had stayed away from the wedding to protect an image. Now that image was cracking, and for the first time, they were afraid they might not be able to blame me for it. The news of Maddie's engagement came through a group message I wasn't part of. I heard about it from my cousin instead. "She's engaged," she said, then paused. "Your mom is already planning everything." I pictured Elaine energized again, back in her element, a luxury ballroom in downtown Chicago, 240 guests, private fittings, vendor lists, the kind of wedding designed to be discussed before it even happened. A few days later, my aunt called, Elaine asked me to help secure the venue, she said. I told her I couldn't. Why not? I asked. There was another pause. Because I couldn't stop thinking about your wedding. I didn't respond. I had learned that silence let people fill it with their own conclusions. Then another call, and another. An uncle who said, I'm sitting this one out. A family friend who murmured something about scheduling conflicts. Each conversation followed the same pattern. They asked gently, What happened? I answered honestly. My parents chose not to attend my wedding. That was all I said. Elaine called me that evening. Her voice was tight. People are declining, she said. I'm sorry to hear that. I replied. You've been talking. She accused. I've been answering. I said. She inhaled sharply. They're saying things. They're asking. I corrected. You could help fix this. She insisted. I didn't break it, I said. She shifted tactics. Your sister is hurt. This is her moment. So was mine. I replied. My father came on the line. We assumed you'd support the family. I supported myself. I said, That's new for you. Not for me. The following week, I heard that a designer my mother had bragged about was suddenly unavailable, that the ballroom contract was no longer guaranteed, that people who had once stayed neutral were choosing distance instead. Maddie finally reached out through a mutual relative. I don't understand why you're doing this, she said when we spoke. Her tone was controlled, professional. You know how important this is to me. I'm not doing anything. I replied. You're letting them think badly of us, she said. I'm letting them think. I said. That's the difference. She went quiet, then said, You always do this. You make things uncomfortable. No, I answered. I stopped making them comfortable. After the call ended, Ethan said, You didn't say a single untrue thing. I know. I replied. The truth was moving now, passed from person to person without my guidance. And the more my parents tried to outrun it, the more clearly it followed behind them, saying only what had already happened. I agreed to meet my parents after my father texted. We need to clear the air, not apologize, not explain. Clear the air. We sat across from each other at a small table, the kind of place my mother liked because it felt neutral. Elaine folded her hands carefully. Richard stared at the menu even though we weren't ordering. This has gone far enough, my mother said. People are getting the wrong idea. They're getting an idea, I replied. She shook her head. You're letting resentment color the story. I'm letting the story stay intact. My father finally looked up. You've always been sensitive, he said. We didn't think missing one event would turn into this. One event, I repeated. My wedding. Elaine leaned forward. You never told us how important it was to you. I sent invitations. I said. I followed up. I waited. She waved that away. We thought you were fine. You've always been fine. Something settled in me then, heavy and clear. I wasn't fine. I said. I was quiet. Elaine frowned. Why didn't you speak up? I did. I replied. When you canceled my graduation dinner because Maddie had a modeling callback. When you told me her prom dress cost $4,800 and said it like it was normal. While my textbooks for a semester cost $1,100 and you called them excessive. When you planned a wedding for her years before she was engaged and told me mine was manageable. Richard sighed. You're exaggerating. I'm counting, I said. My mother's voice sharpened. You're jealous. That's what this is. I am, I said, but not of her career. Not of her wedding. I'm jealous of how easily you loved her. The table went quiet. Elaine recovered first. We loved you both equally. No, I said. You loved us differently, and you pretended it was the same. Richard tried to interrupt. This isn't helpful. I didn't stop. You taught me that waiting my turn mattered more than my happiness. That keeping the image intact mattered more than showing up. Elaine's jaw tightened. If you had just waited until after your sister, she said, None of this would have happened. The words landed exactly where they belonged. I nodded once. Thank you. For what my father asked. For saying it out loud. I replied. I needed to hear it. Elaine looked unsettled. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest, I said. And I'm done explaining myself. I stood. My father said. So that's it. That's all there ever was. I replied. When I walked away, my chest felt tight, then light, not relief. Release. I had carried their version of me long enough. Leaving it there felt like setting something down that had never been mine to begin with. I did not hear from my parents for weeks after that conversation. The silence felt different this time. It was not punishment. It was distance. Finally honest. Maddie tried once. She sent a message that began, I don't know why you're doing this, and ended with, You're making things harder than they need to be. I read it, felt nothing rise, and set the phone down. I did not reply. When that didn't work, she contacted Ethan. She thinks I should help you be more reasonable, he told me, holding out his phone. What did you say I asked? That my job is to protect your peace, not manage your behavior. That was the last time her name came up between us. The invitation to the Chicago wedding arrived a few days later. Thick paper, careful wording, everything perfect. Ethan looked at me and said, We don't have to decide right now. I already have. I replied. We declined without explanation. One evening, we sat on the back porch, the day settling into quiet. Ethan said, You okay, I am? I said. And this time, it wasn't resilience talking. It was truth. I used to believe that closure required understanding, that if I could just explain myself well enough, something would change. What I learned instead is that clarity does not always come from being heard. Sometimes it comes from hearing them clearly for the first time. My parents will likely tell a different version of this story. That's fine. This one is mine. If you've stayed with me this far, you probably recognize parts of yourself here. Maybe you learned early how to stay small. Maybe you're still waiting your turn. If this story resonates, share it with someone who needs to feel less alone. Stay, listen, and remember that stepping away is not the same as giving up. Ethan reached for my hand and said, You don't look like you're carrying anything anymore. I'm not, I replied. I did not get the parents I hoped for. I did get the life I chose, and for the first time, that feels like enough.